My name is Danielle Dawn, and I'm 47 years old. I was in active addiction for about 15 years. Um, I grew up in a middle class family with working parents. I was the youngest of three siblings. I had a very wonderful childhood. However, the choices that I made when I got to be a teenager led me down a route of addiction. If I'm being honest, it's probably the men that I chose in my life. Um, I got pregnant at 17 by a 32-year-old man, and he was a true blown alcoholic, very mentally and physically abusive. I was with him for about 3 years, separated, met another gentleman, and had two children with him. We were together about 10 years, and we started dabbling with some drugs. And after a couple years, I stopped. But years down the road, I ended up getting married, and I was married for 21 years. And my husband had an accident at work, and he was prescribed many kinds of opiates. He had 3 or 4 back surgeries, and this was in the early 2000s when the opiates was becoming an epidemic. I was going through things with my mother. She needed a liver transplant. Uh, Two of my children's father had just got sentenced to 10 years in prison for drugs. He was taken away from them, and I just had a lot of shame and guilt and resentment and started dabbling with the pills to help me. And that went on for about 15 years. My mom did get a liver transplant. By that time, though, I was already addicted. Um, I was one of them, what I thought was a functional addict at the time. I got up, went to work every day. My husband ended up getting disability. He stayed at home with my 3 children. I worked, provided, but to the outside world, it appeared like I had everything going on in my life. And I probably did, other than the addiction. I was not raised in a church. When I was about 5 years old, my sister was 17. She got married, and the family she married into went to church. So I started going to church from the time I was 5 to 14. So I knew that there was a God and that there was Jesus, but I just didn't choose to live that life. Instead, I medicated myself and just become an addict. Um, I thought that I could control everything with myself. And I thought because I worked, because I wasn't selling my body, or because I wasn't um, using men or whatnot, that my addiction was okay and I was different. But drugs doesn't discriminate against anyone. Um, I was addicted, my husband was addicted. And in 2020, I said something to him about it was almost like an epiphany from God come to me. I was sweeping my kitchen and I can remember this like it was yesterday. And it was like something come over me, and it was like there's more to life than this addiction. There's more than I was robbing Peter to pay Paul in order to keep my drug habit. Yeah, he would get a prescription, but however, when you have two people who are doing pain pills, and we would do methadone, morphine, Suboxone, anything we could get our hands on, Percocet, oxycodone. I mean, it just didn't matter. It's whatever could keep us from having the withdrawals and functioning, and keep things together. But I was sweeping the kitchen, and it was like something come over me, and now I know it to be God talking to me. Like there's more to life than this. This is not. This has been going on for 15 years. This is not something that I wanted to continue to do. So within a few days, I had a conversation with my husband about us being addicts. And looking back, my husband probably was my number one supporter in my addiction because in his mind, um, he stated and felt like it was okay because he got a prescription for the pills. But I tried to point out to him, you get a prescription for them, you abuse them, and I do them, and then we go to the streets and we're buying drugs. It's not okay. This is addiction. And I can remember this night, just like it was yesterday. I looked up addiction and read the definition to him. And he said, we're not addicts. And I said, yeah, we are. And I want to be clean. And he said, there's the door. If you don't like it, you can get out. And said, my obligation to your children is done, because my youngest was the only one at home, and she was in her senior year and she was 17. And my children had no idea that we were even in addiction. And he said, you can go. And I said, you were never obligated to my children in the first place. And in that moment, I knew the best thing that I could do was leave to get myself clean. However, that was in 2020, and I did leave. I didn't go to rehab, and I didn't tell people that I was in addiction. I left and I confided in one person, and this person helped me get a job, helped me get clean. So for about 5 months, I did lead a clean life, and I did come clean to family and friends, that I had been in addiction, and I was trying to deal with things still all on my own understanding. That was in October, and in January, my dad died of COVID in 2021. And when my dad died of COVID, it just alivened something inside of me, and I relapsed. And in my relapse, I not only went back to the pain pills, but I moved on to heroin and fentanyl. And I started hanging out with my husband, thinking that, I don't know really what I thought. I think initially when I was hanging out with him, I thought that I was clean at the time, and I thought that I could help him, but he was into heavier drugs too. And then when my dad died, it just ignited something inside of me that just made me almost go crazy, I guess. My children, in the mix of it all, started not talking to me, as they were proud because I was getting clean, but then the whole relapse happened, and it was an embarrassment for them. So about a year later, me and my husband are back together, and we're still doing the fentanyl. I'm working still, or doing my best to work, because the heroin and fentanyl did something to me that the pain pills didn't. My life was just a mess. I felt like it was just a whole chaotic mess. My children weren't speaking with me, and that was the hardest thing, because I had raised them and done the best that I could do for them. I ended up just a train wreck, and I would go with my husband over to the state of Ohio, and we would buy fentanyl. And this one particular day, we went to Ohio, like we did any other day, and we bought some fentanyl. Coming home, I nodded out at the wheel, and I wrecked the truck and totaled it. We hit a utility transformer. Luckily, we weren't hurt seriously, but the truck was totaled. But we had 30 grams of fentanyl on us. And the police came. But the police didn't. The craziest thing in the world is that they didn't search us, and they didn't suspect drugs. They gave us a ride to a hotel. So we spend the night in a hotel, and we get up the next morning, and I said to him, let's try to get out of here before something happens. Our phones were dead, and we had no vehicle, and he said, oh, I'll just rent this room another night. So we proceeded to do some more fentanyl, and I nodded out and went to sleep. And when I woke up, the hotel room door was open, and it was an outside hotel, and I could see my husband sitting on the top of the stairs with blood pouring down his head, gashes all over his face, and I seen the police around him. And before I could even swing my legs over the bed to stand up, the police were in our room wanting to know what my husband was on, because they felt like he was nodding out and he was ODing. And I denied that we were on any type of drugs. In the end of it all, they wanted to know if I was on something, because they said I had foam coming from my mouth. They ended up Narcaning us, and they searched the room, and they found 30 grams of fentanyl. We got taken to the jail, went to the hospital, and then went to the jail. So I'm in another state that I'm not even from. I'm in jail, and I have a felony 2 drug charge and a felony 4, because they found a 2-gram fentanyl rock in my cigarette pack, and in a bag in the room they found 28 grams. The 2-gram rock was absolutely in my cigarette pack, and the bag was his, but he wasn't saying that what was his and what was mine, and neither was I. So we both were arrested on a F2 and a F4. And 7 days into the jail, my husband had a heart attack, and he got moved to a hospital. and the judge had us under a $200,000 bond, which was the best thing that could have happened because in that jail, it took me 15 days to detox from that fentanyl. I laid in the jail floor, puking, fevering, cold chilling. I went through withdrawals from fentanyl like I'd never went through a withdrawal from any other kind of drug. But had I been on the street, I know that I would have went straight back to using just to prevent those withdrawals. So looking back at the moment, it was horrible and it was awful and I just wanted out of there, but that was God. God was sitting me down to let me know, hey, this is what has to happen. You have to either get clean or be 6 feet in the ground. So I started having a God encounter in that jail. The judge wouldn't reduce our bond because we were from the state of Indiana and he thought that we'd be a flight risk. But 7 days in, when my husband had that heart attack, he got out on an OR bond. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and while he was in the hospital, they ended up letting him go back to the state of Indiana. And I didn't hear from him for about 2 months. I sat in the county jail for 5 months total, trying to fight my case and take a plea bargain, and I have never been in trouble. I was 45 years old when I got arrested. I didn't even have a juvenile record. But because of the amount of drugs that I was caught with, and I think because it was because I was from another state, they weren't going to be lenient on me. I was facing a mandatory of 2 to 10 years in prison in the state of Ohio for the F2. When I did get my husband to answer the phone, the first thing he said to me was, I have a prior record. I'm a felon. Not for drugs, but his was for armed robbery, a juvenile record. He had been in trouble from the time he was a juvenile up. His response to me was, I want you to take responsibility for all these drugs, so I'm not going to go back to prison. They're not going to send you to prison. And I'm like, you're crazy. That was fentanyl that we were caught with, and we were waiting on it to come back from the lab, but I already knew it was fentanyl. I knew what I had. We were waiting on it to come back, though, to confirm. But I said, they sent that to the lab to be tested. The moment it comes back as fentanyl, we're both going to prison. I'm not telling them that it was all my drugs. If you're not going to confess to what's yours and you don't want any part of it, I'm just going to end up plea bargaining and I'm going to go to prison and do my time. And that was the last I ever talked to him. I didn't take the rap for all the drugs. I just didn't speak. I ended up taking a plea bargain. I pled to 2 felony 3s and the F4 just to get off of the F2 mandatory time. And I was angry. Oh man, I was so angry because he was my husband. And, for him to ask me to take the charges, my whole world was distraught. But however, I ended up going to court on my 46th birthday that morning. And I got sentenced to 4 years in prison in the state of Ohio. I was devastated. When I got to prison, I was in intake for about 30 days, and I'd been there a couple weeks. And I woke up one morning, and when I say that the Lord spoke to me, he literally spoke to me and said, why are you so angry? Your husband could have said, oh, those aren't her drugs, or, oh, this was mine and this was hers. But where would you be? Your husband would be in prison, and you'd be on the street, and you would be dead. And I knew in that very moment that there was no mistaking that was God talking to me. I knew he was right, because had I went back on the streets and my husband had stayed in the side, I'd have done went back to using. So I was in Marysville. First experience, like I said, I'd never even been to jail. So the 5 months I did in the jail, then got to Marysville to prison. My first encounter with both. But I knew inside those prison walls that if I wanted to change, it had to start there. And God was speaking to me and showing me things in there. And unfortunately, my experience in the prison I was in, I could have found more drugs in there than I could on the streets. I'd never even seen the SWAT team out here on the streets. But inside Marysville prison, the SWAT team was in there once a week. And they were finding fentanyl, and they were finding perk press pills with fentanyl. There was just so many drugs in there, but I knew that God had a bigger plan for me. He was talking to me, and I was picking up my Bible, and I was reading it, I wasn't understanding it a lot, but I was reading it. They have a program down there called Tapestry, and it's a behavioral modification program. And it's a dorm that is at the back of the prison, and they work with you on your behaviors because they think that it's a behavioral issue. And I thought, I've never been to rehab. Here I am in addiction. I've been in addiction for 15 years and nobody knew it. Never tried to rehab, never went to counseling. What do I have to lose? So I signed up for the Tapestry program, and it takes about 18 months to complete. And that was the best thing that I could do because there were counselors and that in there, and they really worked with you on your drug addiction and what makes you a drug addict and what are your triggers and why are you the way that you are. Um, and it was the closest thing that I was going to get to a rehab. So the judge did tell me when I got sentenced that if I done a year and a half to 2 years in prison and filed for my judicial and didn't get in any trouble in there, that there was a possibility he would give me a judicial release. So the time was coming up for me. I'd been there 15 months. Time was coming up for me to file for my judicial. But my whole thing was a lot of people in the judicial go home. But for me, I didn't have a home. My husband he ended up going on the run and got picked up, and he got the same sentence as I did. So he was in prison in Ohio too. We'd lost everything. Lost my car, lost my home, lost my belongings. My children who were grown still weren't talking to me. And it was like, where do I go? What do I do? Where's home look like? And I'll have you know that God had a childhood friend that had done a program in Richmond, Indiana called Crossroad. And I hadn't spoke to her in 5 years, and she just happened to be out on the streets of the store one day and ran into my mom. And she didn't even know I was in prison or that I had an addiction problem. And her and my mom started talking, and my mom started telling her about me. And she said, have her call me. If she really wants to change her life, I know a place that she can go to called Crossroad in Richmond, Indiana. So I called my friend within a few days from prison, and I just knew in that very first phone call there was something in her voice that was different because she had been in addiction for way, way more years than what I had been. And she gave me the information to Crossroads. And I laid in bed that night and talked to God about it. And I knew that was all a God thing. God had been working on me for the last 2 years, from the time I got in trouble until I got to prison, and him lining it up to run into my friend, my mom to run into her, and for me to call. So I called Crossroad, and Joni Reed told me, well, Danielle, we will take you at Crossroad, but however, this was in April. She said, we won't even have a bed until the end of June, 1st of July. So I filed for my judicial, and in my paperwork, I had asked the judge to make it a requirement for me to come to Crossroad. And I explained to him that I didn't have anywhere to go or anything to do, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to be done with drugs, and I felt like I needed more in my life, and that Jesus had been calling me and talking to me since I had been in prison. And lo and behold, I went to my judicial hearing, and the judge approved it, and he mandated for me to come to Crossroad only because I had asked him. Normally they would just let you go home. And I come to Crossroad, and when I got here, I had began working on my relationship with Jesus, and I have been redeemed and set free by Jesus Christ. I have 2 years sobriety. I follow Jesus, and I try to do everything in my power to help other people who are in addiction. I try to be the best version of me, and I try to be more like Jesus each and every day. I ask for him to guide me and lead me to who I need to be a light for. Drugs does not discriminate against people. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you've been through, or what you haven't been through. Drugs will take over anybody's life. And just because you've been to prison and just because you're a drug addict does not mean that your life ends there. There's so much more. You can change, and you can be saved and set free by Jesus Christ. I like to tell people that I once was lost, but now I'm found. And when I say that, I truly mean that. God has restored relationships with people in my family that I never thought possible that could be restored. I'm 47 years old now, and for the first time ever, I just bought a house in January. I bought and paid cash for my own car. God has provided, and God has really turned my life around. And what He has done for me, He will do for anybody. I am nobody special.